SEP FanFic Readings presents Thanks to the Photographs by Unstable Hufflepuff. Chapter 9. His Second Chance. Draco's Point of View. When Draco Malfoy joined his parents for dinner one night in early December, and his father mentioned having heard through the Ministry of Magic Grapevine that Professor Flitwick was retiring from teaching charms at Hogwarts, he felt as though the world was giving him a second chance. He'd followed his parents before, obeyed their rules, and fought desperately for their approval, and there was no way in hell he was going to do that again. Divorcing Astoria Greengrass gave him an overwhelming sense of freedom. For the first time in his life, he thought he had a choice. He was under the impression that his mother would leave him alone now, that she would allow him to pave his own path in the world. But then his father was released from prison, and everything went, as things tend to when Lucius is involved, to shit. Draco's life became an endless loop of stilted conversations, raised voices, and slamming doors. He spent most of his time at Knott Manor with Theo and Pansy, recently married and finally left alone by the higher-ups of their society, in order to avoid the constant stream of dinner guests and betrothal agreements. "Oh, Draco, darling, do you remember Harold Davies' daughter, Tracy, I think her name is? She was in your year at Hogwarts, was she not? Well, she's become quite the beauty." "You have a duty as my heir to marry and continue the Malfoy line. Time is ticking, Draco. Are you so cruel as to break your poor mother's heart by denying her grandchildren?" "I saw Priscilla Parkinson at Twilfit and Tadding's the other day, dear. She says Pansy and Theodore have been settling in quite nicely. You know, I don't understand why you wouldn't wish to follow in their footsteps. Don't you wish to be as happy as your friends?" "Our name will die out if you do not act now, Draco. Is that what you want? Is it? Because I was under the impression you actually gave a damn about this family." "I know she's never been much of a looker, but beauty potions these days have reached new limits, and that could very easily be remedied. The Bulstrodes are open to discussing a betrothal. Would you please just consider it?" Getting out of Malfoy Manor became a necessity. Draco simply could not handle being around his parents any more, or else his sanity would be at risk. So, the following morning, he sent an owl to Minerva McGonagall, the current headmistress of Hogwarts, requesting an interview. He was fully aware that she'd be apprehensive, but she agreed to meet with him regardless. He was over the moon that someone had given him the benefit of the doubt. That hadn't happened in a long time. It turns out that the charms master Draco had studied under in the year that followed the end of the war was an old friend of Professor Flitwick's. Draco was given the job, though McGonagall made him swear not to tell anyone outside of his close family and friends until September, to minimize the fallout in the media. She worried that parents would try to pull their children out of school if they knew ahead of time that Draco would be teaching them. Lucius and Narcissa Malfoy were beside themselves when one day in late August they found Draco standing before the fireplace in the front hall with his old-school trunk in one hand and flue powder in the other. Narcissa begged him to rethink his decision, promised to find him a suitable match so he could settle down and stop with this nonsense. Lucius shouted that he was tearing their family apart, told him how ashamed he was to have raised such a weak-minded son. But this was Draco's second chance, and he wasn't about to wait around for a third, so he gave his mother a kiss on the cheek and allowed the cool green flames in the fireplace to swallow him whole. The moment he saw Hermione Granger being led to her living quarters on the 4th floor of the castle by Neville Longbottom, he knew that the second chance involved her. He stood there at the end of the corridor, half hidden in an alcove, as she recited her password and disappeared inside with Longbottom. He hadn't seen her since his trial, in which she'd been a silent observer, there to hold Harry Potter's hand while the fucking saint of a man talked Draco's way out of Azkaban. She looked different now. Better. It was Granger herself who gave him the courage to file for a divorce, though she didn't know it at the time. Astoria was kind, yes. She was pretty, very, and she was smart, mildly. But she wasn't for him. They didn't love each other, and neither of them were all that inclined to try. He married her because that was what was expected of him. On that faithful August morning when he came down for breakfast, tired and grumpy from his half-hearted efforts to produce an heir, to find a photograph of Granger being fucked into a 4th-story window by some famous muggle bloke, he realized that if she could throw away everything that was expected of her in order to live her life as she saw fit, he could too. Draco watched her reputation be torn to shreds over the following weeks, leaving her almost as hated as himself. Then an article came out saying she had disappeared, and no one knew where she went. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that if Hermione fucking Granger could say fuck this to the world, then he sure as hell could. He had the divorce papers written up and a quill forced into Astoria's hand within an hour of the article's release. She had Adrian Pusey to swoop in and rescue her. Draco sent them a lovely china set as a wedding present. Then Draco met Granger. Actually met the real her for the first time after knowing her for 12 years, and realized that he was well and truly fucked. Because Hermione Granger wasn't just a bossy know-it-all that protested for house elf rights. She wasn't just the sidekick that followed Potter on every last one of his increasingly stupid expeditions, saving him from near death each time without fail. No, Hermione Granger was cunning. She was downright vindictive when she wanted to be. And she was witty. How the hell had he not known how witty she could be? Every time she opened her mouth, he was actually interested in what she had to say. Spending time with her could be considered fun. It was mind-blowing. When Longbottom let slip that she'd kept Rita Skeeter imprisoned in a jar as punishment for all the nasty articles she'd written about her and Potter during their 4th year, many of which Draco himself had unfortunately helped with, the first thought that ran through his head was, "Fuck, that's hot." And the second, "Fuck, I think Granger's hot." And then it became infuriatingly difficult to look at her in the eye. He was attracted to Hermione Granger. What sort of cruel punishment was this? Was this part of his second chance? He couldn't like Granger. Friends, sure. They had even been a little more than he'd initially wished for. But now? He once thought she was beneath him due to her blood status. Now all he could think about was getting her beneath him. In his bed, on his desk, on the floor. He wasn't picky. All of a sudden, every time Granger was near him, his heart rate went up and his palms got all sweaty. It was as though he was 13 again and wondering if Pansy would let him kiss her when they went to Hogsmeade. Merlin, and it was like Granger had no idea what she was doing to him, touching him all the time and walking around with a fucking sugar quill in her mouth. He made the mistake of asking Blaise Zabini for advice. Being a notoriously self-proclaimed ladies' man, he figured Blaise would have some sort of idea that could help him. In reality, Blaise had laughed and laughed until there were tears in his eyes, and then he laughed some more. After finally calming down, he gave Draco a pat on the back and leveled him with a grim look. "You're fucked, mate." Pansy and Theo, the unhelpful buggers, agreed. "Well, I suppose you have 2 options," Theo said as he refilled Draco's tumbler for the 3rd time that Friday night. The 4 of them were in the first-floor sitting room of Knott Manor, lounging comfortably with their shoes kicked off and their ties loosened. No need for good posture and polite small talk when no one else was around. "You can either go for it and then be disowned when Lucius inevitably finds out." "Delightful," Draco grumbled, slumping further into his love seat. It was fuchsia, matched absolutely nothing. Interior design was Pansy's latest hobby. "Or you can continue being her friend and live the rest of your sorry existence knowing deep down that Hermione fucking Granger was the one that got away." "I marked it on the calendar, you know," said Pansy brightly, swirling some of her sparkly pink concoction in her glass. "The day Draco fell for the Golden Girl. I think we should celebrate annually. Make it a holiday of it." "I'll second that," said Blaise, and the pair raised their glasses to each other in cheers. "You know what they say about karma, Draco." Draco took a sip of fire whiskey, glaring at him over the rim of his tumbler, and said nothing. "Pansy?" "They say karma's only a bitch if you are," said Pansy unhelpfully. "And you, my friend," said Theo gravely, plopping down next to Draco with his own tumbler of fire whiskey, "are the biggest bitch of them all." "Thanks, everyone," said Draco dryly. "It's times like these where I really value your friendship." Pansy heaved a great sigh, rolling her eyes in the most over-the-top way possible. "What the fuck did you expect, Draco?" she said harshly. "You waltzed in here, announced that you have a thing for Hermione Granger, of all people, and then downed a glass of fire whiskey as though the world hadn't just spun off its axis." "Oh, shut up," said Blaise, and for a second, Draco was grateful that his friend had come to his defense. But then the bastard kept talking. "Draco's at perfect liberty to shag whomever he pleases, and everyone knows Granger spreads her legs for just about everyone these days. A couple of fucks and this whole thing will blow over." Draco sank even further into the heinous love seat, feeling a headache coming on. He shut his eyes in the hopes that everything around him would just melt into obscurity. "Well, Draco?" said Pansy coolly. He decided not to respond. "Is Blaise right? This is just about sex, isn't it? That's all you want from her." "Of course it is," said Blaise confidently. "Can you imagine him in a relationship with that swat? Going to dinner together? Holding hands?" He made a retching noise. Hell would sooner freeze over. There's no shame in shagging her a few times. Even I thought those photographs that came out of her in that muggle 2 years ago were hot. Fuck yeah, they were. Couldn't believe it was even her at first. But there's no mistaking that hair. Oh, don't even get me started on her hair. I've still got a few copies if anyone's interested. Gross, Blaze. That's just gross. I'm proud of who I am, pansy not, depravity and all. I will not let you shame me. A hand dropped to Draco's knee, giving it a rough squeeze, and he opened his eyes to find Theo watching him intently. You're awfully quiet over there, mate. Draco groaned and shut his eyes again. She defended me to my students on Monday, he said miserably. Fucking threatened them to start treating me with respect. Silence. And then, you're fucked. Draco opened his eyes once again and raised his head to look at them all. Sighing, he muttered, Yes, that appears to be the consensus. Theo immediately topped up his drink, and Draco took it gratefully. Your father's going to disown you, he said. Most likely. You're going to break Narcissa's heart, said Blaze. An unfortunate side effect, yes. Well, I suppose we could all just cross our fingers and hope that she still despises every last bone in your body for calling her a mudblood for 6 years straight. Fuck off, Pansy. I mean, she does sort of have a point, Theo began tentatively. Watching Draco out of the corner of his eyes, he spoke as though fearing he'd suddenly jump up and start screaming obscenities at him. You did treat her pretty horribly in school. All of us did. There's a good chance she'd never be with you because of that alone. Don't you think I know that, Theo? Said Draco hotly. I did everything I could to bring her down back then. And for what? To make myself feel better. Because she was inferior to me. Fuck. She bested all of us in every class. There was nothing she couldn't do. That's not how Muggleborns were described to us. It was all a fucking lie, and I still treated her like shit. He paused to draw a deep breath and set his tumbler down on the floor to run his hands furiously through his hair. You know she's still got that scar on her arm from where Bellatrix carved that fucking word into her. It was a cursed blade, never fucking healed. She has to live the rest of her life with a constant reminder of what my aunt did to her, in front of me. I was there and I did nothing. She has every right to hate me. She should hate me. Mate, you couldn't have done anything, Theo said gently. Fuck that, shouted Draco, leaping to his feet and causing Theo to flinch, scooting further away from him as he began his pace. I should have at least tried. I should have... Fuck, I've never even apologized. She's been saying we're friends now, and I never... He came to a halt, a sinking feeling in his stomach. I have to go. What? Demanded Pansy, getting to her feet. Her eyes widened when Draco took off, bolting out the door. Draco, it's the middle of the night. What the fuck do you think you're doing? Come on, mate, she's probably sleeping, shouted Blaze, though he did not make any attempt to follow. You can talk to her tomorrow, said Theo exasperatedly, rushing after Pansy. You're drunk. But Draco refused to listen. He can't believe he had gone on this long thinking he wouldn't have to apologize, wouldn't have to make it up to her after all the horrible things he'd done. Merlin, he was sick. How could she even stand to be near him? Seeing her scar had brought back some of the worst memories from the war. He'd been having nightmares all week, every last one of which she'd been the star, and he'd still said nothing. Pretended not to even notice. He'd been facing her every morning after waking up in the dead of night with her screams still ringing in his ears like it was nothing. Draco, stop this, Pansy pleaded, grabbing his arm when he reached the front doors of the manor. Draco wrenched himself from her grasp, shaking his head angrily. You're only going to make a fool out of yourself. I should have fucking apologized the second I saw her again, said Draco sharply, giving Pansy a glare so heated that she took a step back. I am not waiting another minute. Granger, are you awake? Draco knocked again. He wanted to bang his fist against the door to get her attention, but he didn't think this would end well if he managed to get her riled up. He was sweaty and shaking. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed to tell her exactly how sorry he was. A second chance meant nothing if she never forgave him. He realized that now. He leaned his head against her bedroom door, out of breath. He'd sprinted all the way from the front gates without stopping, continued climbing the stairs even with a stitch in his side. He could hear his heart pounding in his chest almost painfully. Clenching his hands into fists, he inhaled shakily. Hermione. There was a rustling from the other side of the door, then a soft groan, followed by a sleep-riddled voice. Draco? He almost gasped in relief, opening the door. Granger was sitting up in bed, squinting at him through the darkness. He stumbled forwards, nearly knocked into her bedside table, and finally collapsed at her side, clutching her hands in her lap. "I'm so sorry," he said at once. He dropped his head to her lap, too afraid to look at her. "I'm so fucking sorry, Granger. I should have said it sooner. I should have said it years ago. Oh shit, he thought. I'm about to fucking cry." She carefully withdrew her hands from his grasp, and he squeezed his eyes shut to stop the tears. She hated him. She would always hate him. He would never be worthy of her forgiveness. But then she brought her hands down to his shoulders and gently pulled him up onto the bed beside her, wrapping him in her embrace. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, and she was so warm, smelled so sweet, and it felt like coming home, and, oh, fuck, there's the tears. "Draco, what happened?" she asked quietly. "I was awful to you," he whimpered, sniffling loudly. I'm so sorry. I never should have called you that word. I should have done something when she... "Shh, breathe, Draco," whispered Granger, and it was as though she'd hypnotized him. Air suddenly filled his lungs and he drank it in, inhaling and exhaling to match the rise and fall of her chest. She tightened her hold on him and brought one hand up to rub his back. "It's okay." Draco shook his head resolutely. "No," he spat. "It's not okay. How can you even stand to be near me after all I've done? After all I didn't do?" Granger sighed. It was a sad sound. "You couldn't have done anything even if you wanted to," she said softly. "It's not your fault, Draco." "But I was awful to you," he said, his voice breaking in the most humiliating way possible. You should hate me." "Yes, you were awful. You were cruel and childish, and I did hate you. For a long time. Mostly because you made me hate myself." Draco released a great, racking sob, and she rested her head on the top of his, still rubbing his back soothingly. "But you're not that person anymore," she continued, "and neither am I. You're one of the few people left that I actually feel comfortable around, you know? In fact, you're probably my closest friend at the moment, strange as that might be." She sniffled a little then, and he wondered if she was crying too. Leaning down, she pressed a wet kiss to his forehead, and he knew she was. "But I don't hate you anymore, Draco." You promise?" "I promise." He sobbed in relief, wrapping his arms around her middle and burrowing his face deeper into the crook of her neck. In return, she turned her body so they were chest to chest and held him just a little bit closer to her, once more resting her head atop his own. "I'm so sorry, Hermione," he whispered, hoping she knew how much he cared, knew just how important she was to him now, knew how desperately he needed her to just... "It's okay, Draco. I forgive you." It was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard,